What if I told you that Europe's most elegant banquets, glittering with candlelight crystal and courtly music, once served a dish torn from the coffins of ancient kings? Yes, for centuries, the continent that crowned geniuses and built cathedrals swallowed the dead of another civilization. Hit subscribe if you dare to follow this descent into appetite and authority, because the deeper we go, the more the silver lids lift to reveal the one feast history hoped you'd never see. It begins with a Renaissance fever dream, caravels beaching at Mediterranean quays, bales of silks and spices thudding onto wet planks, and then a shape that freezes the dock workers mid-shout. A human figure lacquered in resins wrapped in sun-browned linen, smelling of salt and centuries. Europe wanted Egypt as a trophy, and the mummy was the crown jewel proof you could pluck immortality like a souvenir from a tomb. In drawing rooms perfumed with orange blossom, nobles staged unwrapping parties. Wine-poured wagers laid a hush as knives slid beneath linen. 1 layer, 10 layers, 100, until a face hardened by time stared back through glassine resins. To own a mummy was to own a myth. To strip it bare was to strip the ancient world of its final dignity. Yet the guests were not satisfied. They wanted to take Egypt into their blood. Apothecaries obliged. On shelves beside cinnamon and rue, a brown jar labeled mumia prepared. They told patrons it came from the resinous flesh of the embalmed rich with a power that preserved bodies for millennia and would fortify the living. In mortar and pestle, a low thunder of grinding. In the air, a metallic sweetness like wet coins and honeyed pitch. A pinch into wine for headaches, a smear on bandages for wounds, a draft for trembling hearts. How could the brightest minds endorse this? By a double error that looked like truth. First, a mistranslation. Arabic physicians praised a mineral mumia bitumen, while Europeans assumed it meant the bodies themselves. Second, a theory with a seductive name, sympathetic medicine. If embalmed flesh resisted rot, then consumed it might teach your own tissues the lesson of defiance. In that syllogism lay a market, and in the market a quiet calamity. Doctors to princes wrote prescriptions for powdered mummy. Philosophers like Francis Bacon praised its virtues. Shakespeare slipped mummy into his lines as medicine. In England, a king, Charles II, sipped king's drops, a tincture rumored to contain human skull and husks of antiquity. The message flowed from throne to street. This was not barbarism. This was remedy. And yet, in apothecary basements, the pestles kept striking like hammers over graves. Demand devoured supply. The Nile's west bank shook with illegal picks at night. Tombs breathed dust into moonlight. Mummies once laid out in ranks like soldiers were stacked into cargo like timber. Merchants broke limbs to pack more tightly labeled crates, priest or prince, and sold the legend by the pound. Choose your vintage, sir. Witness the grinding for freshness. Inhale the proof of antiquity, a scent of pine resin salt and something the nose refused to name. Even painters joined the feast of fragments. The color mummy brown stained canvases with a warm, somber glow. Rembrandt shadows from a funerary glaze. In one studio, a young apprentice uncorked the pigment and gagged. Her master shrugged. Art requires sacrifices. She watched brushstrokes darken a noble's portrait and wondered if the face in time would leach the dead back out as if the painting itself might exhale sand and prayer. Scarcity sharpened deceit. When grave-robbed pharaohs ran thin suppliers, turned to fresher sources. Unclaimed corpses condemned criminals, hospital dead. They embalmed the recently deceased with pitch and spice, wrapped them tight. Faked the brittle patina of centuries with smoke and sunlight. The customers did not notice or pretended not to. After all, the label said Egypt and the story was half the cure. The other half was the price. And then the banquets. Paris, the 1680s. A salon of mirrors and murmurs. The host a collector with a chronic pain and a taste for spectacle. Guests nibble sugared almonds, then hush as he presents a covered dish and declares it ancient medicine best taken communal. Under the lid, a sliver, the color of varnished walnut, perfumed with cloves washed down with fortified wine. Laughter toasts a glow of superiority. No one meets the eye of the empty chair at the table, the one reserved, it seems, for the dead. Word of these macabre soirees spread like perfume and rot across Europe. In London, rumors claimed dukes served pharaoh's flesh as an amuse-bouche before pheasant. In Vienna, whispers told of an empress who stirred mummy powder into her chocolate. Each tale embroidered in the retelling made the practice sound less like horror and more like fashion. To decline a taste was to admit superstition. To partake was to prove sophistication. Yet beneath the laughter of salons, tomb raiders in Egypt dug faster, hungrier. They knew a body's worth rose with every headline of European nobles boasting about their vintage mummies. Villages along the Nile watched their ancestors vanish ship by ship, coffin by coffin, the sand bleeding history into foreign markets. For every aristocrat sipping a tincture in Paris, a grave in Thebes collapsed empty into silence. The medical claims multiplied. One doctor swore a dose could cure epilepsy. Another praised its power against plague. Apothecaries published thick tomes listing afflictions from toothache to melancholy, all relieved by the dust of the embalmed. Patients desperate for hope believed. Families grieving purchased powders to heal the next living child. And with each prescription, a little more of Egypt's dead passed into European veins. Picture the pharmacy's shelves lined with jars of chalk amber violet petals, and beside them, brown granules marked simply mumia. The customer enters, clutching coins, describes a pain that will not cease. The apothecary nods, measures a pinch, stirs it into wine. The liquid darkens thick as syrup. The patient drinks, shudders, and convinces themselves the bitterness is proof of potency. The cure, they think, must be working. And sometimes, strangely, it did seem to work. A bruise faded, a fever broke, a headache eased. Placebo coincidence, or the strange psychological alchemy of believing you had swallowed eternity itself. For the physicians, such results were enough to keep the pestles grinding. And for the desperate, no cost was too high if it meant survival, even if survival came at the expense of the already dead. Meanwhile, artists delighted in the forbidden pigment. Canvases across Europe glowed with mummy brown. Landscapes shimmered in hues mined not from earth, but from flesh. In a studio in Florence, a painter confessed he could feel the presence of the ancients in his brushstrokes. Another scoffed. If their souls object, let them speak through the canvas. Thus, even art, which should preserve memory, became a quiet accomplice in its erasure. By the 1600s, Egypt itself was running out of the ancient dead. Reports tell of merchants offering newly prepared mummies, their fabric still damp, their resins fresh. Buyers rarely asked questions. They wanted only the illusion of antiquity, a whisper of the Nile in their glass. Fraud and faith danced together, and Europe, drunk on its own cleverness, applauded the performance. The practice was not confined to nobles and apothecaries. Middle-class families purchased small packets, a household remedy to keep by the hearth. Mothers sprinkled it into broths for sick children. Soldiers carried it in pouches to mix with wine on campaign. From the grandest palace to the humblest cottage, the dead of Egypt traveled unseen guests at countless European tables. There were warnings. A few Arabic physicians condemned the custom as barbaric. Some European voices, too, whispered unease. Was it truly Christian to feast on human remains? Yet these doubts were drowned in the clamor of commerce. As long as the trade enriched merchants, as long as kings and queens endorsed it, the grinding wheels turned. To question mummy medicine was to question authority itself, and then came the grotesque refinement parts prescribed for parts. A headache, powdered skull, heart palpitations, a scrap of cardiac tissue, limping, a tincture of mummified feet. Apothecaries advertised these specialties like vintners describing grapes. Patients requested them, eagerly believing specificity meant certainty. Behind the counters, jars filled with fragments stood in rows like a silent, dismembered army awaiting consumption in the name of healing. In the courts of France and Spain, mummy medicine became almost ceremonial. When a noble fell ill, servants rushed not only for leeches or herbs, but for the prized vial of ground farro. Physicians presented it solemnly as though offering a sacrament. The powder floated on wine like dust in moonlight, a ritual both grotesque and holy. To refuse it was to refuse the wisdom of centuries or so, they were told. Meanwhile, grave robbers in Egypt devised cruel innovations. When genuine mummies grew scarce, they sought the freshly dead. Corpses from hospitals, slaves, and executed criminals were coated in tar, wrapped hastily, and aged in smokehouses. By morning, they were ancient. These counterfeits sailed north to Europe, sold for gold. The buyers, drunk on the idea of immortality, never questioned the faint scent of freshness. Imagine the warehouses along the ports of Marseille or Venice, crates stacked to the rafters, some rattling faintly with bones, others leaking resin. Dock workers joked nervously about curses, while merchants assured them it was all for medicine. Cats prowled the shadows, gnawing at linen scraps that fell from torn bundles. The line between commerce and desecration blurred until it disappeared entirely. Writers of the era sometimes hinted at unease. A French poet described nobles toasting with goblets of kings, their veins filled with dust of pyramids. A Spanish friar warned that such practices invited damnation, for the body was sacred even in death. Yet these voices were whispers in a storm of demand. The craze rolled on, defended by science, sanctified by profit. In the salons of Paris, mummy banquets became spectacles of refinement. Candles dripped wax like tears onto porcelain plates. Musicians played gentle airs while servants carried in dishes dusted with a secret spice, the flesh of the embalmed. Guests raised their forks laughing, competing to show who could consume the most without flinching. Behind the laughter, an unspoken chill, they were feasting on people who once prayed to their own gods. A rumor spread that certain vintages of mummy tasted sweeter, especially those from priestly burials. Collectors boasted of owning fragments of royal mummies, though most were fakes. Still, the claim itself carried prestige. To dine on a pharaoh's flesh was to dine on history, to swallow power itself. Vanity masked as medicine. Greed disguised as ritual. The color mummy brown grew infamous among painters. Some joked they painted portraits with the very bodies of their ancestors' enemies. Others grew uneasy. In one London studio, when an artist learned the pigment's true origin, he ceremoniously buried the tube in his garden as though giving the dead a final rest. But for every conscience stricken, a dozen brushes dipped again into the sepulchral hue. The trade reshaped Egypt itself. Tombs, once sealed for eternity, stood open, ransacked. Families mourned not just their ancestors, but their stolen dignity. Centuries of heritage crumbled into powder on European tongues. What began as curiosity became cultural cannibalism, a theft of memory disguised as health. And yet to many Europeans the practice felt progressive, even enlightened. It united medicine, commerce, and fashion. To sip mummy wine was to declare oneself modern, worldly informed. They saw themselves as inheritors of Egypt's secrets, never realizing they were merely robbers at a feast, gnawing on bones that were not theirs to claim. But cracks began to show. Some patients worsened after treatment. Others vomited violently. Whispers rose that apothecaries were cheating, selling dirt or sawdust as mummy. The aura of certainty dimmed. Still, the faithful clung to their jars and powders, unwilling to admit they had built their health and their pride on a grave mistake. In England, whispers told of a king's private potion, Charles II's King's Drops. Behind velvet curtains, the monarch himself drank a tincture laced with powdered skull and mummy dust. Courtiers marveled at his vigor afterward, convinced the dead had lent him strength. What they did not see were the tremors in his hands, the hollows under his eyes, the illusion of health propped up by superstition. Across the channel, physicians competed to outdo one another in exotic prescriptions. One claimed mummy mixed with rhubarb cured melancholy. Another insisted that powdered heart of an embalmed priest calmed palpitations. The wealthy demanded these remedies with pride, as though swallowing the past proved their sophistication. Each vial that changed hands carried both hope and desecration. Travelers to Egypt recorded their horror. A 12th century Arab scholar, Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, watched Europeans cart mummies away like sacks of grain. He wrote that no civilized people should ever defile the dead so brazenly. But his words faded in foreign libraries, drowned by Europe's hunger. The tombs continued to empty silence, replacing prayers once sung to the stars. The mummy market even developed grades like wine or spices. Royal stock merchants boasted pointing to bodies said to belong to princes. Priestly blend they offered to apothecaries at lower price. And for the common folk, powders scraped from whatever fragments remained, sometimes mixed with asphalt or bark. No one could be sure what they consumed, only that it came wrapped in the glamour of Egypt. In coffee houses of London, patrons debated the merits of mummy medicine as if discussing politics. Some swore it saved them from gout. Others claimed it worked wonders on wounds. The irony was sharp in rooms devoted to enlightenment and reason. Men of letters calmly discussed their preference for flesh, ground from ancient graves. The age of reason drank from a cup laced with darkness. The demand gave rise to gruesome spectacles. Some apothecaries allowed customers to choose a piece of mummy and watch it ground fresh like a butcher slicing meat. Children peeked over counters to see limbs reduced to powder wide-eyed, not with horror but with curiosity. Such sights became ordinary, the grotesque folded into daily commerce. Painters, too, continued to celebrate Mummy Brown. Portraits of nobles glowed with a sepia warmth that whispered of desert sands and forgotten tombs. The patrons smiled proudly, unaware or unwilling to care that their likenesses were tinted with the very bodies of strangers robbed from eternity. Every brushstroke was an unmarked grave, but the tide was shifting. As the 18th century dawned, physicians began to test remedies rather than repeat tradition. Slowly, painfully, evidence-mounted mummy powder did little more than any dust. Headaches lingered, fevers burned, wounds festered despite the sacred tinctures. Doubt began to creep into minds once certain. The foundation of faith cracked. Merchants tried to preserve the trade with clever marketing. They claimed only true Egyptian stock retained power, that failures came from counterfeits. Prices soared for authenticated fragments complete with false documents of origin. Fraud multiplied, feeding on fear of being deceived. In reality, nearly every jar by then was a forgery, embalmed criminals passing as pharaohs. And still at banquets, the charade continued. Nobles raised their cups, whispering about vintage and provenance, their laughter masking unease. For behind every toast hung a shadow, the suspicion that what they drank was not a gift of immortality, but the last cry of a civilization devoured grain by grain. The Enlightenment, with its lamps of reason, finally began to shine into these shadowy practices. Scholars studying hieroglyphs realized the Egyptians had never used bitumen in embalming, shattering the very premise of mummy medicine. It had all been a mistake, a mistranslation that spiraled into centuries of desecration. The revelation spread like wildfire, and with it came shame. Physicians once proud of their prescriptions now grew silent. Textbooks quietly dropped recipes calling for mummy flesh. Pharmacists hid their jars or relabeled them as antiquarian curiosities. In private, some admitted the truth: their patients had been swallowing little more than powdered corpses and lies. Yet the memory of centuries of practice could not be erased so easily. In the streets, satire blossomed. Pamphleteers mocked nobles for dining on kings. Cartoonists sketched physicians grinding coffins like spice mills. The very practice that once marked refinement now marked foolishness. The public, quick to forget its own complicity, laughed at the image of powdered pharaohs spooned into aristocratic mouths. But behind the laughter lay unease. How could reason itself be so blind for so long? Museums newly founded across Europe began to collect mummies not for grinding but for display. Where once a noble unwrapped a corpse for amusement, now scholars preserved them behind glass. The shift marked progress, but it also bore guilt. Every exhibit whispered of those countless bodies lost, not displayed, not studied, but consumed and erased. Egypt too reeled from the theft. By the 1800s, tombs once lined with generations of the dead lay barren. Families who had kept memory alive for millennia faced empty chambers and broken coffins. A culture's bridge to its ancestors had been ground away in European pharmacies. No restoration could return what was lost. Some writers of the 19th century confronted the horror directly. They described Europe as a vampire feeding on the flesh of a civilization it claimed to revere. They painted nobles as ghouls sipping mummy wine by candlelight, oblivious to the insult carved into history. The metaphor of cannibalism clung to the practice a stain on Europe's self-image of enlightenment. Archaeologists, now working with a sense of science rather than greed, began to catalog what remained. But their discoveries only deepened the tragedy inscriptions naming mothers, priests, soldiers, lives once meant to journey eternally into the afterlife. These were not anonymous relics, but people. The thought that their bodies had been ingested as medicine turned excavation into mourning. The practice, once mainstream, became a memory people wanted to bury. Nobles avoided speaking of the banquets they had attended. Families denied having purchased powders. Physicians claimed their predecessors had been fooled, but never themselves. Silence became a salve, as if not speaking of the crime could erase its echo. Yet the irony lingered while Europe mocked ancient superstition. It had lived by one of its own, the belief that immortality could be stolen through the flesh of the dead. The mummy craze revealed not just ignorance, but the lengths to which power and desperation will go when cloaked in the authority of medicine and tradition. And so the chapter closed with a paradox. The age of reason, which prided itself on clarity, had spent centuries gnawing on shadows. Europe's obsession with Egypt left not only scarred tombs, but a scar on its conscience. The ghosts of the consumed whispered in the silence of museums reminders that even civilization's brightest lights can cast the darkest feasts. Imagine walking into a 19th century museum, marble floors echoing under your boots. Behind glass lay the last, untouched mummies, silent witnesses to a crime already complete. Tour guides spoke of ancient gods and embalming rituals, but the air itself seemed heavy with accusation. How many brothers and sisters had been ground into dust before these few were spared? Historians began to tally the losses. Some estimated hundreds of thousands of mummies vanished into Europe's appetite. Not only kings and priests, but farmers, children, and artisans all reduced to powder. Whole genealogies dissolved in apothecary jars. It was not just bones that had been consumed, but memory, lineage, and prayer. Yet, paradoxically, the very act of desecration fed Europe's obsession with Egypt. The hunger for relics, paintings, and artifacts grew even stronger. Egyptomania swept across fashion and architecture. Obelisks rose in city squares, sphinxes guarded gardens, hieroglyphs adorned furniture. While the dead were devoured, their culture was mimicked, distorted into ornament. For Egyptians themselves, the practice remained a wound. Travelers and scholars from Cairo lamented how their ancestors' graves had been looted in the name of medicine. They wrote with bitterness that Europeans who preached civilization had behaved with less honor than thieves. But their protests rarely reached the salons of Paris or London, where mummy lore persisted as romantic curiosity. By the late 1800s, however, a new sensibility emerged, respect for the dead as human beings. Archaeology matured into a discipline demanding preservation. To unwrap or consume a mummy became taboo, shocking to polite society. What had once been spectacle was now scandal. In this reversal, Europe revealed its guilt not by confession, but by silence and denial. The autopsies performed on the last royal mummies brought a final chill. Scholars recorded deformities, diseases, and traces of the embalming process. Reading their reports, the public gasped. The bodies bore signs of human struggle, frailty, and suffering. They were not talismans, but people. The grotesque irony was clear. What had once been medicine was now evidence of a tragedy of misunderstanding. Writers used the episode as a warning. They argued that science without humility becomes predation, that medicine without ethics becomes cannibalism. Look, one essayist wrote at how easily the brightest minds believed a lie because the lie flattered their pride. The mummy craze became an allegory, a mirror showing the danger of authority unchallenged. And even today, fragments of this past linger. Tubes of mummy-brown pigment still sit in drawers of old studios. Labels from apothecaries survive in archives reading simply "Mumia prepared." Each artifact whispers of hands that ground lips that drank and lives erased. They are reminders that civilization is only as noble as the respect it grants the dead. So the story of Europeans eating mummies is not a grotesque footnote, it is a parable. It tells us that even cultures priding themselves on enlightenment can commit horrors under the guise of progress. It warns that desperation for healing, for power, for prestige can blind us to the humanity of others. And perhaps the darkest lesson is this: those who sat at the mummy banquets believed themselves civilized, refined, and wise. Yet history remembers them not as enlightened, but as devourers of the dead. Their legacy is not triumph, but shame, a feast of shadows served on silver plates. Picture again those candlelit halls of Europe's nobility, gilded mirrors, laughter, echoing violins playing. Now imagine the secret ingredient of the evening's delicacies, the flesh of long-buried strangers from the sands of the Nile. Guests raised their glasses and congratulated themselves on refinement, never realizing that centuries later they would be remembered as participants in a horror cloaked as sophistication. The irony is almost unbearable. These same elites who condemned barbarian practices elsewhere were swallowing corpses in their own dining rooms. They spoke of progress, of reason, of divine order, while gnawing quite literally on the remnants of another people's eternity. Hypocrisy had never worn such silks. For Egypt, the cost was irreparable. Temples stripped, tombs looted, and mummies scattered. Every empty sarcophagus was a silence in history, a page torn from a book no one could ever read again. What Europe called medicine was in truth cultural annihilation masked as cure. Yet, to the Europeans of the time, mummy consumption seemed rational, even enlightened. They believed they were drawing on ancient wisdom, taking into themselves the secret of preservation. The fact that it was based on a mistranslation did not matter. Authority had decreed it true, and so truth bent to the weight of crowns and titles. Centuries later, as archaeologists carefully brush sand from sarcophagi, the contrast is haunting. Where once mummies were crushed for powder, now gloved hands preserve even fragments of linen. The reverence of today is born of yesterday's desecration, as if the modern world is trying too late to atone for a banquet that should never have been served. But the lesson is not buried in the past. Even now, society chases miracle cures, swallows promises wrapped in scientific jargon, and trusts authority without question. The story of mummy medicine warns us that progress without skepticism leads not to healing, but to horror. The ghosts of those consumed still haunt Europe's conscience. They are not nameless. They were mothers, fathers, artisans, and priests, each with their own prayers and stories. To reduce them to powder was to erase not just bodies, but lives. It is a theft more profound than gold or jewels, the theft of memory itself. And so history records not the triumph of medicine, but the madness of belief. It shows us how desperation for immortality can make even the most brilliant civilizations commit acts of quiet savagery. The mummy craze was not a curiosity, it was a mirror held up to human folly. To stand before a mummy in a museum today is to feel that weight. The glass case is not just protection, it is confession. It says we once betrayed you, turned you into pigment potion and feast. Now we try to guard you, though we can never return what was taken. And that is the true horror of this story. Not simply that Europeans ate mummies, but that they did so with pride under banners of enlightenment in the name of science and progress. It reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we dare to admit, and it leaves us with a question that lingers like incense in a tomb. What horrors dressed as wisdom are we still swallowing today?